on this Tuesday, we are now approaching the release of patch 11.0.5. I guess by now, if you are from NA, unless you got your usual 10 hours long maintenance, you also already are inside of patch 11.0.5. Now, this anniversary patch is bringing a lot of extra content, not that usual for a mid-season patch, but of course, what we are focusing for today is also what is making the rounds within the community, which are the balance tuning changes that we have already touched on a few times in the past couple of weeks that were going to come with this patch. Now, why am I saying the changes are making the rounds? It's because just today, a few hours ago, many players have seen the Wowhead's article of the expected class tuning changes coming straight from the class writers from multiple different class discords, and of course some of these changes have let's just say surprised a few players, even though also some of these were known for quite a while based on the tuning that was going to come. But of course, for the much wider player base, some of these might have come as a surprise, right? Because of course, if we start with the two main culprits of this are the changes given to Arcane Mage and to Frost Death Knight. This, of course, to many players would come as a surprise, because when you look at Frost DK, right now, Frost DK is having a pretty good time in Mythic Plus, right? Frost DK is amongst the most broth specs in Mythic Plus. They have amongst the most damage in Mythic Plus. Even if you switch to the Raid, Frost DK is also doing reasonably well. Even in terms of just only damage, they are also towards the top. So why exactly would you want to see them buffed, in this case, for example, by 8%? Right? So the buff comes from the Deathbringer hero talent. Frost DK itself isn't even being touched, it's just the changes given to the hero talent tree. And the major positive of this change, switching from the live version to the patch version, were the swapping around of the talents. The most positive one is now that you get to use both of these at the same time, because now Painful Death is baseline to your Exterminate, which means that now in the patch you get to use Swift and Painful, which is a very good single target damage buff, and you get it for free. The other positive is that previously you were taking Wither Away over Dark Talons, but now Wither Away has been moved in place of Blood Fever, which does very little damage, is a very poor talent, and now you get to replace it with Wither Away. So now you get to take both Wither Away and the newly added talent Reaper's Onslaught, which of course also buffs your single target damage in particular by also giving you a lower cooldown on Reaper's Mark. Now, ideally, in Blizzard's idea, this was supposed to nerf by removing a couple of your AoE focused talents in Deathbringer. This was supposed to nerf your AoE damage overall and buff instead your single target. Because if we exclude for a second that Frost DK is the mega flavor of the month spec in pretty much both Mythic Plus and Raid, in terms of just purely their single target damage, their damage to bosses, they are not doing like amazingly. So Blizzard's plan was, okay, we're gonna buff your single target by 5, 6, 7 whatever percent, and at the same time you're gonna be nerfing your AoE. The problem is that these changes did not do that. The changes actually are not really going to be nerfing their AoE damage while also buffing their single target at the same time. That is the problem in the buffs given to Frost right now. The other complaints from the player base, of course, came from the other one being buffed, which is Arcane. Now, Arcane is in a, well, similar position to Frost. Arcane is, again, doing very well in the Raid amongst the top single target results. And then in Mythic Plus, Arcane is also doing quite well in terms of popularity as a pick. Unlike their damage, which for a while we have been seeing being quite middling in Mythic Plus, they were still amongst the more represented specs in Mythic Plus. Unlike Frost DK, most of these positive changes are happening pretty much just in their general changes of the spec, not really in Spellslinger, which is getting a big buff, but still is not the play for Arcane, and also not for Sunfury, which is already the choice of the spec, but rather just in the additions they get in their spec 3. And this has left players similarly confused because, of course, they already saw Arcane doing well, and they were wondering why exactly are they receiving this buff. This one isn't even a hero talent specific set of changes, but to their baseline features, like adding a pretty good and now always taken talent like Ether Vision, for example. So things that just improve the spec by default. So players were just confused as to, why do you look at Arcane and decide that they deserve to get buffed? Then of course things get worse when you compare this to the other expected changes to the other specs, because while some changes might be understandable or might be okay, not, let's just say, not too hurtful. For example, giving out buffs to outlaw, to subtlety, to survival, even to frost mage, right? These buffs are okay, these buffs are understandable. However, if you remember back when we looked at these changes and went on a winners and losers type of eye test based on the tuning, we were wondering, okay, but what about the warriors and the warlocks and shadow priest and even balance druid? These specs don't seem to be gaining that big of an increase across this set of balance tuning, either because there are changes while there are many, and while they might even improve the way the spec plays, they aren't actually improving their damage in this case, or in other cases, like when we mentioned for Warlock and for Warrior, it's because their changes aren't even there. Like the specs aren't even getting changed that much. If anything, the few ones are negative. Like for example, in the case of the AoE of Warriors having Odin's Fury, having now damage reduction, a target cap at 5 targets instead of 8. So again, you go back to their current performance. The current performance of warriors in the raid is in the bottom half. The ones for warlocks are also, all 3 of them, possibly for the first time ever, all in the bottom half of the results. You try to look at the glass half full, well, maybe they are performing very well in Mythic Plus. Right, maybe they are present for their AoE damage, for example, in Mythic Plus. Not really. The Warlock specs, as well as the Warriors, but also other specs like Shadow Priest or specs like Feral Druid, for example, not receiving too many positive changes, are not really doing that well. And same goes for the popularity of the specs in Mythic Plus. Even if we switch for their average damage, it's not looking good for any of them. So again, you kind of understand the current thought process of many players, which is, why are we buffing specs that are already doing well and not buffing specs that are not doing that well at the moment? We did also mention this likely going to be the case when it came to Paladin, for example, Holy Paladin being nerfed, because despite all of this might seem positive, hoping for some major rework, this will actually end up being a negative set of changes for your throughput as a Holy Paladin, and the very small buff you're gaining, which is this, is not enough to counter the changes given to your general 3 in terms of changes. The only one who does likely get stronger even after the not too positive changes from your general 3 is protection, because they also do get a significant amount of positive changes in their own spec 3. So you might be seeing more improvements, more popularity, growth in Protection Paladin. But you do kind of understand the frustrations of some of the player base, because it does look like a kick in the nuts. It does look like twisting the knife in the wound when you are waiting for a patch, not quite a mid-season patch, but an early season patch, and the biggest bonuses are going to the already strongest specs, in this case Frost Death Knight and Arcane Mage, and there's not really that much of a focus being put on the weaker specs that you might have wanted to see get better. We have mentioned some are, okay, we're not saying they are all being completely neglected. All 3 of the rogue specs, for example, are being buffed. Survival is being buffed. But there are many others which are more confusing. For example, why is Windwalker only buffed by 3% in damage, and why is Feral only buffed by 2% in damage, or Marksmanship buffed by 2% in damage, compared right now to the buffs given to Frost Death Knight and to Arcane Mage. And even if Blizzard were to revert this, maybe by the time this video is out, maybe by tomorrow, they're like, whoops, we kind of messed up our numbers, we're going to just give a flat out 10% damage reduction to Frost and a 10% damage reduction to Arcane, that will still not be overall positive. If you just removed these 2, and they would just end up being some, neutral changes without actually increasing their damage, you would still be lacking quite a lot of positive improvements from the already powerful specs. And even the nerfs would be quite quite confusing. You know, if you're thinking about the better performing specs that might be needing a nerf right now, you know, you look at the current average scores right now in Mythic Plus. If you don't want to look at that, you can just look at the top runs from Mythic Plus keys, or even the popularity in high keys, or you just switch to the raid and look at the performance in the raid. Then what you would be looking in terms of nerfs would be specs like Arcane. Specs like Frost Decay, maybe Enhancement Shaman. If you move over to Mythic Plus, you could definitely be looking at Prot Warrior. You could also be looking at Resto Shaman, as we mentioned, for something a bit better than a Poison Cleansing Totem nerf. We have almost forgotten, of course, amongst all of this drama, the actual big elephant in the room that still exists in Mythic Plus, known as Augmentation Evoker. That is still a problem. So even if we were to purge from our memory these two things possibly being fixed by Blizzard today or tomorrow, the overall changes are still not very positive. You still aren't seeing this in the actual picture because the shamans are sandbagging. You know, they're trying to make it look like it's a neutral change and you're just changing your stat priority. This is like a 30% AoE damage buff and 10% single target damage buff. They will actually be here in terms of buffs. It's just that the Discord guys are trying to make it sound like it's totally no biggie what they are about to get, elemental shamans, with these changes. But in their case, even in their case, it wouldn't be as egregious. They are not one of the top Mythic Plus specs right now. They are not in the top runs. If you're seeing this, it's an enhancement shaman. When it comes to the raid, they are actually completely average. So even then, even if it was the case, it wouldn't be nearly as egregious as the set of buffs given to Frost Decay and to Arcane Mage. So that is the highlight of the complaints we are about to see today, and we will also see tomorrow, and we will likely continue to see for the following days until likely Blizzard does something about it. So we will wait and see if this is all we have to look for this new week, for this new reset, or if we are planned to see any extra changes getting into this new reset. But for today, on this Tuesday, which is now time to leave each other, we're starting the goodbyes as usual by thanking everyone for having watched the video, as well as, of course, everyone who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, surprisingly, I was able to fix my sleep schedule in just a day. I thought it would have been much longer, but I'm not complaining.